Welcome to the Guest at Marris Consulting series. We're doing an off-site because we're in Berlin right now, and we're taking advantage of the TOCICO conference here, the Theory of Constraints Annual Congress, and where lots of people turn up with long histories of theory of constraints, and I'm very pleased to be able to meet and get him to present his talk story. Will Hoefle.
Thank you very much. I started the TOC journey, if you will, probably around when I was in the university. My father had worked, as I believe you did, with Creative Output in LA back in that probably mid-'80s time frame. And then by the time, so I had sort of gone through those years hearing a lot about Ellie Goldratt and Opt and the goal and things like that. So when I went to university, it was always sort of in the back of my mind as I got my degrees, and trying to reconcile what I was being taught in the university with what I was being told was what they shouldn't be teaching me in the university anymore.
Right.
When I graduated college and went into graduate school, I started working part-time with the Goldratt Institute, which had been formed at that point as sort of the subsequent company to Creative Output, helping with, at the time we had EDMs, or executive decision-making workshops, which I think were essentially a combination of drum buffer rope and throughput accounting, or what there was of it at the time.
So that's the Opti game, or is that something else again?
That was still the, at that point it was using the simulators, those wonderful DOS-based, cutting-edge 70,
At the time it was...
at the time it was very good. So the production and distribution simulations primarily, but then always tucking a little bit of throughput accounting in at the end. But then when I finished my master's in '96, I went to work for the Institute full-time as essentially as a consultant, mostly out in the field, doing implementations and some training and things like that. Right about that time, it was '96 or '97 when the book Critical Chain came out. Practically overnight, our client base, or our sales mix, switched from a lot of drum buffer rope and supply chain to critical chain and development chain, because it was so many companies at that point felt that they had their production at least somewhat under control, but it was their projects where they were just losing time and money again and again. So from '96
By
till...
the way, you think that's changed?
I don't think that's changed.
Okay.
No,
Right.
no, I think that's still the... I think there's still a number of places who need the help on the operations, but compared to what it was in the 70s and 80s with infinite scheduling, that part of it is usually not where the bang for the buck is in a lot of companies. It's getting things from concept to volume manufacturing in the first place, at least in my experience.
Okay. So no, you're back at the critical chain turning up.
Right, and about that time, for probably the next 5 years, I worked on practically nothing but critical chain implementations. Around that same time, the software to support it started coming out. We had originally Concerto with what was originally Speed to Market, and then Realization Technologies and ProChain, and a couple of others that were trying to sort of get into the market. Yeah,
and you used that in what companies?
Lucent Technologies
one of the first?
Was one of the first. It was actually, I believe it was the first multi-project critical chain implementation with software in the U.S. So we did that in partnership with Sanjeev's group and at the time Speed to Market, but it's the Concerto software. Mm-hmm. And what they were designing were switching systems for countries. Mm-hmm. So it was really interesting because in critical chain, the multi-project, when you come from a production environment, a lot of people tend to think of a drum as a physical resource, like it's this machine or it's that machine. But we found in that case it was their test labs, because they had all of these switching systems, and they had these $10 million test labs that had to simulate the traffic for an entire country.
And that's still very true. So certainly we've been doing it ever since. And if there is slightly expensive testing facilities, they're going to be the gating, the capacity constraint, the virtual drum, the problem to watch out for. Yeah.
Right. So that was interesting for me, especially coming from production side, seeing really kind of opening my perspective on what the driver can be. Next after that, shortly after that, was Seagate Technologies, which they made high-end hard drives, but not for personal. They also for personal computers, but the division we were in, they would build hard drives to go in a whole bank of a wall full of them to run train systems and banks and government. So they were into disruptive products. So we implemented critical chain there, and that was very much they design it and then they mass produce it. But in that particular market, if you miss your launch cycle by as little as a quarter or 3 months, then you essentially lose at least 50% of your market share and revenue. And we managed to finish that project. It was like 33 days ahead of schedule, but because of that, their largest competitor at the time, I'm not going to say which company it was, dropped out. They didn't even release their product. Mm-hmm. So for Seagate, that was not only did they finish it on time, but it was a huge boon relative to their market share and their positioning.
Yeah, and that's something that's still very current, right?
Sure, exactly. And several other companies. One of my favorite stories, and it's a short one, it's not really a story, but an example, was Herman Miller, which is one of the largest office systems manufacturers in the world. They designed like the Air chair, which practically every office in the U.S. Has these days. The first project we were asked to work on with Critical Chain, they had target of getting the development from concept to their volume manufacturing to get it from 24 months to 18 months.
Right.
Because they were really concerned about the market window. And we wound up getting it, completing it with fewer resources than we were supposed to have in 12 months. It was one of those implementations and one of those experiences where there was just so much potential in the way that they had scheduled. It wasn't even just the logistics of their scheduling. It was everything came together, and when they were able to look at the real value stream of the critical chain and put it into a place with the buffers that they could see it, we were able to cut a year out of it, and it was less stressful with less resources. So, in my opinion, it was almost a textbook way to go. In the early 2000s, we started doing a lot of mixes of critical chain leading into manufacturing. We wound up working with a lot of machine shops, which is always a combination of, is it DBR or is it project management? And depending on how they're set up and what they like, you can make an argument either way. We went from, during that period, there's also a lot of production work with the big three, because at the time they were still trying to consolidate inventories and shorten lead times on their tier 1 and tier 2.
The big threes being?
General Motor, Ford, and Chrysler.
Right.
Then around 2003, 2004, we sort of switched to trying to work with a lot of small, medium-cap private companies, which have pretty much all the same problems as the large companies, just different political environments. And there are pros and cons to that. You can do a lot more of them faster, but sometimes it's you wind up getting sucked into becoming their part of the management team, whether that was the intent or not. But that took me pretty much through till late 2007, 2008, where we did some work with Boeing Space Technologies in El Segundo, which was also critical chain multi-project, trying to get these $500 million satellites up 23,000 miles up over the equator with 85% of the work being done not inside your own four walls. So it was an interesting challenge. And then that worked on a number of other things. But around that point, I took over a project for a private company internally. And from 2010, 11 till now, I've primarily been running large projects.
Okay. Have you ever counted how many implementations globally or critical chain or whatever you've done?
No, not really.
Guess?
The thing is, over 50, but most of the implementations that I did in the first several years were like 2 year, very large.
Sure.
So I didn't do too many of them at the same time. We usually had 2 or 3 going. When we scheduled ourselves the same way, we had tried to stagger out our projects.
Yeah.
But as far as on the production side, I've probably been through hundreds of manufacturing shops just because there's so many small, and then they've got their suppliers and their suppliers, and once you start walking down the supply chain, it's
I understand. Okay, well that's very impressive. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.